And now a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from the region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. This is the gospel of our Lord. Can you please respond? Thanks be to God.
I have no idea how Hollywood works. I have no idea how the film industry adapts to its realities, but I've always really wondered, how do people go about casting infomercials? Is there like a cap on experience, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're too qualified of an actor to work on this infomercial"? Because if you've ever seen even the briefest infomercial, the people in there are ridiculous. The first part of the infomercial is always people who just struggle to do very basic human things. And they always pose the question, "Has this ever happened to you?" And have somebody who's like, fall over the place. "Have you ever fallen out of your chair or dropped silverware everywhere?" They seem to be the world's clumsiest people. And then the narrator always acts like it's just a common occurrence. I'm sorry if you've ever acted like any of those people in an infomercial. Do not order their product. Call a doctor. There is something seriously wrong with you. But the whole strategy of an infomercial is to establish a problem. And they go about it the most ridiculous, over-the-top way just to make it clear that some people indeed have this problem. And then step in a C-list celebrity to explain how you can buy something to fix that problem. This morning we're going to talk about what is one of the hardest verses in the Bible, for me at least. And I want to just start out by planting this image in your brain. That the first part of these verses are Jesus doing an infomercial acting setup. He is doing something just so over the top, terrible, to help you appreciate the solution to that problem. So if this gets challenging, and it is very challenging, I want you to keep that sight on the horizons. That is the goal. We will end up there. Jesus is doing something over the top to give a solution. So to dive into the scripture for today, it's the story of Jesus and his disciples. They go to a Gentile territory within traditional Israel, and a Canaanite woman comes and starts pestering them, publicly pestering them, just calling after them all the time. Now, the term Canaanite is really weird and kind of out of place. See, Canaanite was a catch-all term for all of the cultures and all of the people who lived in Israel before the Israelites took over. This would be Israel before Joshua conquered everything. They probably wouldn't have referred to themselves as Canaanite at that point. They would have called them Gentiles or specific different regional peoples. The whole catch-all Canaanite is something that was a term that wasn't used in the first century. But that's to establish a relationship there. In Israel, Canaanites were below the Israelites. Joshua and the Israelites conquered the Canaanites, so the Canaanites were supposed to know their place. So there's a social dynamic there, a social difference between Jesus and this woman that he's trying to avoid. Beyond that, there is a gender difference. In the ancient world, men weren't to talk to women, and men definitely weren't supposed to talk to women of a lower caste than them. So here's this great rabbi, this respected, famous rabbi, walking through town, and this Canaanite woman comes begging and groveling at their feet. And he ignores her. See, the part that makes these verses the hardest for me and for a lot of people is that Jesus doesn't behave like we expect Jesus to behave. We like to think of Jesus as the John 3:16 Jesus, and that's all he was. He was nothing but loving, affirming, compassionate, and uplifting. That's all he ever did. So when we come to this verse, it creates challenges. See, what he does is, first, he ignores her. This woman is in great distress. Her daughter is afflicted with a demon. And it doesn't matter how you interpret what the concept of demon means, is that her daughter was struggling, her daughter was suffering. And that she had this boldness to go and address a man and a Jewish man. That would have been physically dangerous for her. That if she would pester them and accost them in public like that, Jewish men had the right to beat her and possibly even kill her or have her stoned. She was putting her life on the line to come and beseech this rabbi who she had heard that had great power and great compassion. And how does Jesus respond? Well, initially, he just ignores her. And then the disciples are like, come on, Jesus, just kick her out here, send her away. Just tell her to go home. And then Jesus turns around and calls her names. In fact, he refers to her as a dog. I think in modern context, I'm not going to say the word, but in modern context, we would think of a different name for a female dog, but that's the implication here. Because, you see, dogs in the ancient first century world weren't the pets that we love them today. The ancient Israelite world would not have spent billions of dollars feeding them, grooming them, and getting them cool little sweaters and hats. No, back then, dogs were mostly seen as scavenger pack animals. Sure, I'm sure a lot of Israelites did keep them as utility animals to help them hunt and protect things, but by and large, most dogs were considered to be these mildly dangerous pests that would follow them around, just like this woman was doing with Jesus then. I've come to feed the children of Israel. What good is it if I toss their food to a dog? It's a very, very mean-sounding Jesus, isn't it? Why would Jesus act like that? When I was doing my preparation for this sermon, I went through and I did a deep dive. I have 4 or 5 commentaries that I always go to first, and they didn't give me much. It's kind of fascinating that some of the commentaries I read, they didn't even talk about what Jesus had said to the woman. They talk about the woman's great faith. In the Gospel of Matthew, great faith is not something that Matthew just throws around. Matthew uses the term little faith. Oh, you of little faith. Oh, with a little faith, you can move mountains. Oh, you of little faith. He only uses the term great faith twice. That's with this woman and a centurion. So, a lot of scholars skip Jesus' behavior here because it's hard. It's very difficult. The scholars who are brave enough to address the issue, they say that Jesus is testing the woman. That he always intended on helping her, but he wanted to see what kind of faith this woman had. And I don't know if that helps. To me, that almost sounds worse. Oh, Jesus knows that this woman is struggling, so he's going to take time to test her? To make her jump through hoops so that way her afflicted daughter can be healed? Again, that doesn't sound like the Jesus that we know. Now, I want to throw out a disclaimer here that I do have my theories, and I'll explain my theories. And a lot of these are my theories. I'm always trying to be clear that, this came from a book I read, this comes from our doctrine, and this is just Nate's wild speculation. But I also want to just throw out there that this verse has been used to hurt a lot of people. It's been used to justify misogyny within the church and within religion. It's been used to justify political disputes when it comes to territorial arguments. It's been used to do a lot of harm. And if you come to this passage and you see a man in power treating a disempowered woman in this way and you just are revolted, that's fair. That there is a lot of behavior here that possibly it can be explained, but it might be over the line, and for some people with certain life experience, it may not be forgivable. I get that. If this is something that you struggle with, I would love to have a personal conversation with you so that way you know that you have someone you can listen to. That the true heart of Christ is one of kindness, and we'll get to that. But out of the gate, Jesus' words here are very harsh, very condescending, very mean. And with that type of attitude, it creates all kinds of questions. Back in college, me and a couple buddies were on a road trip. And late at night, we got into this big, deep debate on whether or not the three of us could lift a half-ton truck off the ground. Now, the premise from one friend was that a half-ton is only 1,000 pounds. Like, the three of us, gripping this thing right, could totally lift up and get it off the ground, at least for a second. We could do it. If there's a fourth one there, no question. And myself and the other friend, we look at him like, that's not what a half-ton truck means. A half-ton means that's how much that truck can carry in the bed. That's its payload amount. And we debated this for at least 45 minutes because college road trip, middle of the night, that's just what you do. And by the end of this debate, my friend looks at me and he goes, look, Nate, you say potato, I say I'm an idiot. I thought that was one of the most entertaining and gracious ways of admitting shortcoming. See, we all have those moments where we know we make mistakes. We know that we are in the wrong, and we have a huge moral dilemma at that point. Do we back out of it? Do we deny? Do we apologize? Do we double down? And far too often, we as human beings, we go the wrong route. We know that, like, oh man, I am dead to rights, but I can't admit fault. I can't admit wrongness. And that's a huge, huge flaw in how people are hardwired. I believe, and again, this is my own belief, this is my own understanding of this passage, is that Jesus here is giving us an example of what it looks like to recognize that we are in the wrong and respond with grace. This is such a big issue that Jesus could have had a discussion with his disciples, and he did this many times, about how the disciples were wrong, and he corrected them, and the disciples just submit. It's something else entirely to be in the position of authority, position of power, the position of I get to declare my own rightness, and then still graciously admit wrongdoing. It's my belief that this is what Jesus here is doing. But let's dive into the specific details here. So, Jesus as a historical person. Within Christian theology, we believe that it's called the duality of Christ. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. 100% human, 100% God. In his godliness, he can be 100% both at both times. It's not one or the other. And like at this point, Jesus is a human. At this point, Jesus is God. No, that's a heresy. I can't remember which one. But that creates a lot of questions and interpretation, especially when we get to passages like this. We believe that in Jesus' divinity, he is perfect and without sin. But I think talking down to a woman and calling her names sounds less than perfect and kind of sinful. So if we take all of these assumptions about the truth of Christ, and they are the truths, but then we read this passage, it requires you to really dwell and pray and think on it. Or like a lot of those scholars that I mentioned from the commentaries I read, just skip it all together. I'm not as smart as those scholars, so I like to dive in. So a little bit about who Jesus was. He was a Jewish man in the first century. And with that comes all types of cultural beliefs. As a Jewish man, he believes that Israel was just exclusively for the Israelites. That Rome and the Gentiles, the Canaanites, they have no place in this territory. And if they're there, well, by golly, they should succumb to their masters, the Israelites. And again, there were gender expectations of the day. That women don't get to address rabbis. Women don't get to address men in authority. So Jesus' initial response is one from that cultural context. If you look to his disciples, they expect him to say something like that. Jesus, just send her away. Get her out of here any way you can because she's so below us, it doesn't matter what we do with her. So Jesus says this, and it's really fascinating because Jesus is very quick-witted. He is talking circles around the greatest scribes, scholars, and Pharisee in his day. But here is this Canaanite woman who has a quip back. I'm here to feed the children of Israel, not throw the fair food to the dogs. But even dogs are allowed scraps from the table. I have a lot of women in my life who I'm very close to and I adore, but I've always heard stories of them having to take this approach with men in authority in their lives, be it bosses or parents or whatnot. That a direct challenge would just be responded with a direct challenge. So to play the meek card is to appease an ego. A lot of women, especially in the workplace, are forced into that submissive, subordinate role. That they have to use their cunning and guile while still being meek to respond to that. Far too often, if you see a woman in politics or a woman in business, and it doesn't matter what business or what politics, if she gets beyond a certain point and expresses a desire to go higher, she's criticized for ambition. Ambition in men is considered to be a positive trait, where it's considered to be an undesirable trait in women. So this woman responds in a way that's clever but still submissive. And Jesus hears the truth in her words. Where most of us would hear the truth in their words and then double down, like, but blah, 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 or pretend like it wasn't an issue or sidestep the whole thing. Jesus in his divinity responds with grace. He gives her the highest praise of everyone he gives in the Gospel of Matthew except for the centurion. He lifts her up and instantly cures her daughter. We have this moment where we see what it looks like to be a person in authority, a person in power, to admit that they were wrong and try to make amends. This is a trait that we always have to practice. That if we go through and just assume that we get to a certain point in life and we don't have to be accountable to our wrongdoing, that in any situation we can just walk away from either that situation, that job, that relationship without apologizing, without making amends, we're ignoring the lessons of Christ. That this lesson was so important that Jesus had to give us that example personally. Does that excuse his treatment of this woman? I don't know. Possibly not. But still, it is important for us to look at that and ask ourselves, how do we respond to feedback? If someone calls us out on an improper behavior or an improper belief or something wrong in our actions or ideology, do we ever have the moment of grace of Christ to look at that and say, you're right? How many big fights with your spouses happen because you haven't done that? The author, Robert Heinlein, has this great line. He says, in any argument, as soon as you realize you are right, apologize immediately. Because Robert Heinlein knew that people don't like to be wrong. That people will fight harder if they know they're wrong, whereas if they're right, they have the confidence, and that confidence will lead to grace, whereas insecurity leads to conflict and sin. The best lesson we can learn from this is one where admission, submission, and apologies are the most important thing that we can learn. We talk about how we have to learn to disagree and be respectful. In that, there is no, that's true by the way, but there's no acknowledgement of, well, what happens if we are proven wrong? What happens if we challenge to the very core of who we are? How do we respond then? Respect is out the window at that point because it's just such a challenge. Are we able to go through and say, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for pointing out this big blind spot in what I've been doing. Good Christians and good leaders grow. We grow by extending that sense of grace. We grow by extending that sense of confidence and communication. This was one of the most challenging verses I've ever had to read, and looking at that, I really wanted to skip it. There's another verse option that I could have preached on. Real easy. Hey, what you say is what defiles you. It's not what you eat. Boom! 5 minutes and we're done. But rather, I wanted to grow. I wanted to look at this and either rail against it or find truth there. And I found truth there. And we find more truth and more opportunity for growth when we listen and accept feedback and give grace and thanksgiving in that feedback. So, in this really conflicting time, in this time of civil unrest, of civil trial, rather than focusing on how we are right and what we are entitled to, we are born into a society, we are born into a position, we are born into a place, and with all of that comes certain rights and entitlements. Rather than focusing on what you are right about, can we focus on listening? Can we hear the flaws in our systems? Can we hear the flaws in our culture? Can we be as gracious as Christ when those flaws are called out? And do we have the strength to grow to include those that we've excluded? Do we have the strength to lift up and love those like Christ loved the Canaanite woman? A woman who would have been lesser, that was disrespectful in calling him out. Because it's that love that caused Christ to listen in the end. Up to that point, he acted as we all would have acted in that place, as we all are currently acting in our lives now. But the call of Christ isn't to be who we are. The call of Christ is to be like him. And in this passage, Jesus gave us such a great example of what it looks like to hear that we are wrong and grow beyond that.